I'd like to thank the conference organisers for the invitation to present this keynote today. It's an honour. Thank you especially to the Museum Studies Graduate Certificate Program of the Department of American Studies and the Director, Karen, for facilitating me to be here. And thank you to the people of this place and the spirit of this place, and I pay respects. I'm here this morning to tell a story I've told a number of times, so I apologise to my FEMA colleagues and others who've heard this story before, but with the latest updates. This is a story about how the Cultural Heritage Institution in Vanuatu, the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, with the support of traditional leaders and community activists, has been strategizing to maintain our cultural heritage and the resilience of our communities in the face of pressures to develop, where development means more money and more of the things that money can buy, which necessitate a turning away from culture. While this story is not directly comparable to other Pacific Island countries, it nevertheless reflects the range of challenges that island nations and indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific face. So I was happy to put that map to start so that we can all learn more about the Pacific and what the countries are and the communities that are there. So while this model that I'm going to talk about is not readily transferable, I hope it can serve to inform other cultural institutions and communities of the possibilities that exist for institutions to take social action. So I'm going to present my talk in three parts. The first one, I'm going to set the scene, introduce some of the key concepts and issues, and then secondly, I will describe the strategies that the Cultural Centre has developed to attempt to safeguard our living cultures as the wellspring of the cultural heritage. And then thirdly, I'll briefly describe some of the main challenges I'm now facing in government from a macro-national policy perspective. So, setting the scene, that's the Pacific Islands. As a region, it's made up of over 20 states and territories in an area covering half the world's surface. This region is special because it has the highest rate of indigenous people within the national population of any region of the world, and also the highest proportion of land and sea area held under customary or traditional tenure. Traditional ownership of the land, in fact, is enshrined in the constitutions of most of the independent Pacific Island nation states. Melanesia is a sub-region of Pacific, and this is the sub-region where Vanuatu, you can see down the bottom there, is a part of. So Melanesia consists of the Fiji Islands, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Indonesian province of West Papua, that's called Papua on that map. This is a region of immense diversity, containing about 1/5 of the world's languages for a total population of less than 10 million people. The Republic of Vanuatu is made up of about 80 small islands and a total population of about 220,000 people, of whom 90% are indigenous. With over 100 distinct languages, Vanuatu is among the highest linguistic diversity for its population in the world. There you can see the list of languages. So if a language group can be considered a culture, then Vanuatu is one of the most culturally diverse nations in the world. Largely as a function of the high proportion of the land and sea area held under customary or traditional tenure, many Pacific states, and certainly the Melanesian states, enjoy an unparalleled level of self-sufficiency in terms of food and material basic needs, as well as embodying in their cultural traditions a very high level of continuity with past generations. What I mean by this is that in Vanuatu, the Solomons and Papua New Guinea, for example, the great majority of people, roughly 80%, live in their cultural and kin-based communities on their ancestral land, satisfy most of their food and other requirements using traditional methods and forms of land resource utilization and sea resource utilization on their ancestral lands and seas. They speak their indigenous language and they're governed by traditional leaders. And most disputes are resolved within communities through traditional mechanisms. And most people have been involved to some extent in traditionally customary rituals. An important point to note here is the reliance of the majority of the population on the utilization of resources from their own land and seas for their sustenance: food gardening, hunting, fishing, foraging, using tradition-based methods and knowledge. And this provides most of life's needs for most people. And this is a case also in other Pacific Island states where most people, over half, would satisfy most of their basic needs using traditional methods and resources. And I'll return to this point later. So Vanuatu's culture, therefore, has three main characteristics. There's a great cultural diversity in the country, as manifested in language and cultural practices, although the economic base of all these cultures is similar. Gardening, taro and yam, and that's yams. You can see there yams, bananas and taro. And this is a traditional ceremony that happened a few years ago on the island of Ambrym, one of the islands, where, of course, large amounts of food are presented between clans. And so the long tubers are the yams, and then you have the taros on the side, and you see green bananas behind, green eating bananas or plantains. The second important characteristic is that these cultures are living cultures. The majority of people live and practice their culture on a daily basis. And the third important characteristic is that they are by and large intangible cultures. Because our cultures have no tradition of literacy or literature, and because almost all material forms of our cultural expression use organic biological materials, which quickly disappear in our tropical environments, our cultural heritage is made up almost entirely of intangible elements that are linked to places in the landscape. This is similar to many other indigenous cultures, which are rich in intangible aspects, but have no permanent material forms, such as written text or buildings, apart from stones and sites. Another important part of the context of which I'm talking is that Vanuatu is classified by the UN as a least developed country, or LDC. There are many LDCs in the Pacific, and all the other South Pacific Island states are classified as developing countries, which is a classification based ultimately on the criteria of gross domestic product, or GDP, the amount of production in money terms per person in the country. One of the results of this very low level of GDP is that our Western education systems are quite undeveloped, and there's a very high level of illiteracy in Vanuatu. So we are considered poor countries on a world scale, sometimes what's referred to as the third world, but what some of us like to call the majority world, to emphasize the fact that poor countries are in fact the majority in the world. In the next part of my talk, I will go on to speak about how our cultural institution has sought to discharge its role to safeguard cultural heritage in this context: diversity, living cultures, intangible cultures, developing country. First, though, I'd like to elaborate further on the concept of intangible cultural heritage, which has been codified by its use in UNESCO's Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, a standard-setting instrument which was adopted by the General Assembly of UNESCO in 2003. The development of the concept of intangible cultural heritage was considered necessary because of the focus of the only other international convention on cultural heritage, the World Heritage Convention, which recognized and lauded monumental built heritage. For those of us without such monuments and without such buildings, it was like the UN was denigrating us and our culture. The World Heritage Convention, which was adopted in 1972, recognized sites of outstanding universal value according to criteria skewed towards monuments and spectacular natural sites. And by the early 2000s, most of these sites were still in Europe. In the whole of the Pacific Island states, there was no World Heritage Site, not counting the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, which has been a World Heritage Site for some time. Some more shots of people in Vanuatu. The definition of intangible cultural heritage in the Convention is, and you can read it up there, the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This intangible cultural heritage, transmitted from generation to generation, is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity, thus promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity. This next bit is the United Nations, I suppose you could say, disclaimer. For the purposes of this convention, consideration will be given solely to such intangible cultural heritage as is compatible with the existing international human rights instruments, as well as with the requirements of mutual respect among communities, groups, and individuals, and of sustainable development. So, intangible cultural heritage is basically what the Pacific Islands deals with when you talk about culture. I'd like to go on to, these are the second and third parts of the definition, and you can see the kinds of, in part 2, some of the domains of intangible cultural heritage. Oral traditions and expressions, including language, as the vehicle of intangible cultural heritage, performing arts, social practices, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, traditional craftsmanship. And I'd like to draw note to the use of the new term safeguarding to talk about cultural heritage. Measures aimed at ensuring the viability of the intangible cultural heritage. The use of the new term safeguarding was used in preference to the existing words we used in cultural heritage, which were conservation or preservation, which obviously were not applicable to dynamic, ever-changing living cultures. ICH, constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history. The Pacific Island Museums Association, which some of you may have heard my colleagues talking about in earlier presentations, has a code of ethics which forms the basis of how the organisation operates. And I've put it up there for us to see. You can see the importance to the Pacific Island Museums Association of creator communities. In item number 2 there, a primary responsibility to assist communities to maintain and safeguard their continuing intangible heritage. So I'll just leave that up there for you to look at for a bit. So bringing it back down to Vanuatu and the work we've been doing in this area. I want to talk first about the Fieldworkers Program. The Vanuatu Cultural Centre, which is Vanuatu's principal national heritage institution, has developed a program for involving practitioner communities in the management of their own living intangible cultural heritage. The Community Fieldworkers Program is based on the rationale that the culture of the people of Vanuatu demonstrates a strong continuity with their ancestral cultures, and therefore the most effective way to safeguard and maintain this intangible cultural heritage is to encourage communities to maintain the many aspects of their traditional culture in their day-to-day lives. As the crucial characteristic of intangible cultural heritage is dynamism, its continual recreation by the people that enact it, it is essential that practitioner communities define for themselves what they consider to be aspects of their culture worth safeguarding, and be actively involved in deciding what safeguarding measures to take and how to implement them. The Fieldworkers Program was set up in the mid-1970s. People living in local communities have been selected as fieldworkers to represent different cultural groups and receive training in using notebooks, tape recorders, still and video cameras to record cultural information. Basic ethnographic fieldwork techniques such as dictionary making and the recording of genealogies are also learnt, as are the more general aims and methodologies of cultural heritage preservation and development. These people are mostly, because of the low levels of literacy, they're mostly either haven't been to school, formal school, or primary school leavers or early high school leavers. This training takes place during annual 2-week workshops held at the Cultural Centre's head office in the National Museum in Port Vila, which is Vanuatu's main city. At this time, each fieldworker presents their research findings on a particular topic identified for that year's workshop and learns of corresponding customs in other areas of Vanuatu from the reports of other fieldworkers. These presentations are recorded to preserve this important information. The workshop also includes information on programs being developed by fieldworkers throughout the islands to encourage the maintenance and revival of cultural traditions. Most fieldworkers are involved to varying levels in work to transcribe oral vernacular languages into written forms, starting with the creation of word lists and dictionaries that are used in preschool level. Some of the more experienced fieldworkers have been involved in major cultural research and revival initiatives in their respective areas, often with minimal outside support. One of the most common of such initiatives has been the organisation and/or facilitation of performances of traditional ceremonies and rituals, and in particular the reconstruction and revival of certain rituals from living memory as performance and part of contemporary life. Another has been the organisation of community art festivals, which provide an opportunity for the performance of learning of traditional songs, dances, practices and rituals. Perhaps one of the more significant of such initiatives undertaken by fieldworkers is the establishment of community cultural centres. These are available for use by particular cultural communities or clans as centres for community cultural activities and as storehouses and display areas for aspects of their cultural heritage, including old photographs and written records, which copies are made of at the National Museum and given back to the communities. The picture here is of the opening of one of these centres. Nahai is one of the language groups, and this cultural centre was opened by this particular language community back in 1998. And you can see the actual building in the background, but in the foreground you have the ceremonial ground, which is perhaps the most important place for learning and passing of transmission of knowledge. And you can maybe make out the standing slit drums behind the dancers. And this is one of the ceremonies performed at the opening of this cultural centre. Fieldworkers perform an indispensable role as local community liaisons, facilitators and organisers for the program and work of the cultural centre. At the most practical level, they organise and facilitate the recording of important rituals, practices, and cultural and historic sites by cultural centre staff using written, audio-visual and photographic formats. The recorded material is then archived in the main cultural centre building in the National Museum, and copies of relevant material are returned to the community. All recorded material remains property of the traditional owners. And a particularly important part of the fieldworkers' liaison work is to explain the purpose of such recordings and obtain approval and prior informed consent of traditional owners and custodians for such recording to take place, as well as ensuring the participation of the practitioners in the recording activities themselves. Such participation relies on a level of awareness of the cultural centre's cultural heritage work, which the fieldworker is responsible for imparting to the community, and which is assisted by weekly national radio shows. We also have a cultural research policy which allows foreign researchers to undertake work with fieldworkers in local communities. So all these fieldworkers I'm describing are volunteers. They undertake their cultural heritage work in their free time. The principal benefit for them of undertaking this work is the status of being a fieldworker, which is now a nationally recognised position as in the language, in Bislama, which is the Pidgin English language that everyone speaks. All fieldworkers are members of the cultural communities they represent, speak the community language, and actually live in the communities. At present, there are probably about 100 fieldworkers. We hope to be able to have one man and one woman fieldworker for every culture in the country. And this is probably one of the best strategies we have for dealing with cultural diversity from within a national institution, where you have to deal with all these different cultures within one nation. Also for dealing with a living and largely intangible culture, and also to affect genuine community participation in the management of their own heritage. However, we are in a developing state. We are a nation state with a government, a bureaucracy and so on. And one of the things we have been having to deal with is pressures for development. The fieldworkers have come up with responses to this. And I want to talk about one of these now, which is a fieldworker from this area, in fact not this area, up the hill, a different language, further inland. A male fieldworker called James Teslow recognised that certain traditional ceremonies in his community were not being performed due to a shortage of pigs. Pigs are the most important wealth item in Vanuatu's cultures. As a result, the intangible cultural heritage which constituted ceremonies was not being transmitted, threatening the vitality of the culture. To remedy this situation, he suggested the establishment of a pig bank, which would provide the required animals. Luckily, we had a foreign researcher working in the area, and we were able to get him to write the project proposals required, and got funding from UNESCO for what was called the Traditional Money Banks Project. By the time the project was written up, it had widened its focus to include all the major traditional wealth items, such as yams, which you saw, shell money, dyed red pandanus mats. And we were able to get partners internationally and funding via UNESCO, via its Intangible Cultural Heritage Program. So we wanted to understand how traditional wealth items were produced, to raise awareness of their significance, develop a strategy for promoting their use, and develop strategies to promote their use in contemporary life, in I would say, the westernized sector of life in the country. So we were looking at developing strategies to facilitate the use of food to pay for school fees and to pay for medical expenses at hospitals, because boarding schools and hospitals needed food, right, to feed the students and the inpatients. And instead of having people having to sell their products in the market to get cash to then pay these fees, we were trying to short-circuit the system and get them to use food to pay for these fees, thereby allowing them to maintain production in the traditional sphere. On a larger scale, the project was looking at establishing laws and policies to support the use of traditional wealth items as part of the formal economy, as I've been talking about, and to strengthen the foundations of the traditional economy within culturally appropriate frameworks with a view to stimulating income generation within local populations. So at the most basic level, we were trying to encourage people involved in the production of various forms of traditional wealth to continue producing this wealth, encourage people primarily involved in the cash economy, like myself, to access traditional valuables and use them for ceremonial activities, and to facilitate the exchange of cash and traditional wealth items between the informal and formal economic sectors, both to generate income for people involved in the traditional sphere and encourage the revival of traditional practice among those involved in the cash economy. As we undertook the project, we began to realize that we needed a broader focus. We were talking about these things, but at the same time, the cultural heritage sector was sort of a ghetto within national development policies, which were still talking about economic growth, blah, 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 investment. You know the jargon. The need to address the broader national development agenda led to a decision to partner with the National Council of Chiefs, which is a constitutional body, and to cement a relationship with various politicians who were supportive. This partnership was to become a key strategic alliance, eventually leading the government to declare the year 2007 as the year of the traditional economy. And as part of this year of the traditional economy, we were able to get all the people working in various government departments and NGOs together with traditional practitioners to talk about how do we use our traditional culture or our cultures in policies, development policies, in health and education, in governance, in various other, in everything we talk about when we talk about development of a nation. One of the first steps was an action plan developed, which talked about the importance of our land, which was being leased out and becoming alienated from traditional use, payment for government services, which I talked about already, local trade between islands revitalizing the sailing canoe tradition. And one of the most important was the need to develop homegrown statistical indicators, to develop and to measure and quantify economic activity, including traditional economic activity, and of course well-being and quality of life. Because at this stage we only had GDP as a measure, which did not capture anything I'm talking about, and therefore could not influence policy. One of the most important aims which we continue to strategize towards achieving is to promote production and consumption of traditional foods and to substitute imported foods for local foods. Another major initiative, and probably one of the most important, as you'll see, I'm coming to it, was to look back at the land situation and the situation with the alienation of land, continuing alienation of land from customary control. And this is despite constitutional provisions which said that it had to land maintains itself under customary tenure. I'm trying to speed up for the time here. So one of the key strategies that evolved was linking the cultural institution with a range of stakeholders. NGOs who came together to establish an advocacy coalition for economics. The chiefs were the key stakeholder partner in all of this, as well as National Council of Chiefs, National Council of Women, National Youth Council. And from the beginning of 2007, we had awareness activities continually going on, mainly in the urban areas, because when you went to traditional areas and did this awareness, they said, yes, well, we've been doing this all this time. What are you talking about? The initial success of this project stemmed from the fact that it was able to articulate a very populist view and encourage broader political support, because everyone knew the value of the land, the food, the traditions, and everyone talked about that. It also built on existing practice. For example, school fees were already being paid in certain schools using food items. And so we're able to just expand existing programs. It also capitalized on popular discontent with a lot of government development policies, especially in relation to leasing of land. And then riding on the back of these concerns, we built these strategic alliances I was talking about. And finally, we were talking about preserving identity in the face of globalizing pressures, which was a discourse which we were familiar with from our independence struggle. Vanuatu only became independent in 1980. And prior to that, there was a strong independence movement to get independence. And this movement was echoed throughout the region around this time when the Pacific was becoming decolonized. So this was how our strategies built from the institution through the fieldworkers and communities to become more of a national agenda. So now I'm just going to... This is something that just happened 2 months ago. A fieldworker from another area close to this, you can see the same kind of material culture items, but it's a different language group. A custom school being opened. This fieldworker found that for their community, the main challenge was educating people in the traditions and finding a way to do that, because all the kids were going to school, which was time taken away from traditional learning. So they established this custom school. And you can see here the opening ceremony 2 months ago. And on your right there, you can see a presentation being made from the fieldworker who's standing on the left, presenting a mat, which is a traditional wealth item, to the other fieldworker from the other area you saw earlier in 1998, where they established the Cultural Centre, and he was instrumental in helping him set up the custom school. So he's saying thank you with that mat. This is a lady fieldworker, Numalin Mahana, from the south, a different culture area. For their community, food was the most important. The fact that young people were not learning of the great diversity of food sources in the environment, they were just starting to learn about just a few. And so the object of this food festival was to teach about all these different kinds of food that were available and how to prepare them and how to preserve them and those kind of things. So there she is talking in the ceremonial ground. You can see some of the chiefs up the forehead here with their backs to us, and then in the background some of the women and men who are making the food. That's a grated yam dish, and they're just milking it with coconut milk there, and then it goes in the leaves and then it goes in the ground. So, policy challenges now that we're facing. The main one is land. In the Melanesian region, Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, and the rest of the Pacific, but these are the main land masses. There are huge pressures now, especially in Papua New Guinea. Mining, gas, forestry, logging. In Vanuatu, we're fortunate to have not discovered any minerals or gas yet. But the problem of land being leased, because it cannot be sold. The Constitution forbids the holding of land in perpetuity outside of customary systems. But the state has been facilitating alienation in other ways through leasing. And one of the current moves, one of our main policy agendas now, or one of my policy agendas as a Minister of State, is to try to amend existing legislation to provide for wider consultation and require prior informed consent from all members of a clan before any land dealings can be registered. We have a situation now where our elders in many communities are selling off their clan's land, leasing off their clan's land without consent with the other members. We need to amend existing legislation to deal with many long-standing problems with land. And one of the things we're trying to look for models, and if anyone knows any, I'd be happy to hear about them, providing for legal group holding of land by a group of people, like the clan owning principle which we have in Vanuatu. One of the second important policy area which I want to talk about or just mention is how do we as the state recognize community groups? Because of our experience of colonization, our forms of traditional organization have been fragmented, pretty much denigrated and no longer practiced. We have new forms of leadership in the communities which are not traditional, but we now consider our own. For example, chiefs. Chiefs as such only existed in 2 cultures out of the many in Vanuatu. And in other communities now we have chiefs, but in fact they're a colonial construct. And the construction of chiefs through Westerners, men coming to our shores and looking for other men to talk to, therefore having male chiefs, has been something which has very much disempowered women. And we've done research and found out that in fact this has been the single biggest factor contributing to the status of women in Vanuatu today, which is a low status, is the fact of the experience of colonization. And I did have another photo which I unfortunately don't have time to put in of our women back in the 1800s being dressed up, in the white missionary clothes and stuff, and said, your place is the home, whereas previously they were doing the same things men did in their own set part, in the garden, out in the environment. I was inspired by the call for no time for nostalgia. So we need to find a new way of providing leadership in our communities, and our communities need to tell us, and they are telling us, how do we move forward here? How do we get a way in which the community can have a system which is recognised by itself and recognised by the state, and we can work together? And in that process, as I said, we need to decolonise a lot of what we are saying. A very important policy area which we are having some success in is in transforming our education system. Up until now, we still have the Western education system, basically training our young people to go and work in offices. The system set up by the colonial government to get bureaucrats. Now we've got the bureaucrats, but now we're still training bureaucrats. So last year, a new vision statement for a new curriculum was approved at a national level, and so this new system will incorporate as a major thing teaching of culture and language throughout all the years of elementary school, 1/3 of classroom time to community and custom subjects, and traditional knowledge in science. So an important project that we've been doing is to develop a syllabus for science class that presents traditional knowledge and Western science side by side and shows how traditional practices are scientific and how they can be explained scientifically, and also what the traditional rationale is. Basically to show young people that our knowledge is scientific in the Western sense. It's sort of, we have to justify it in those ways. But another one is to develop an attitude among students, teachers and community members that encourages transmission of traditional knowledge in the home as well as in the school, and encourages the community to be involved in the school, because up until now, the school has been a place where you send your kids and you don't know what goes on there because you don't speak English as is being taught in class. You don't speak the language there. What they're learning is not what you know. So we need to transform it so that what you learn in the classroom is what the community knows and the community can participate. And it's linked to these custom schools I was talking about, trying to make that link so that the custom schools become part of the Western schools or the government schools. And we have now about 40 custom schools throughout Vanuatu, which are going to be linked into this strategy. The fourth policy area we are working on now is in climate change adaptation and response. We have a national action plan for adaptation to climate change, and thankfully, it's based on traditional practices. We've had practices to deal with cyclones and sea level rise for thousands of years in the Pacific, and we need to build on those and revitalize them. Things like weather prediction, traditional early warning systems, use of wild foods and alternative foods. So this is what these food festivals try to find the foods that you eat when your gardens have been destroyed, the foods in the bush. Food preservation, especially in preparation for cyclones and immediately following cyclones. Alternative water acquisition and storage practices, medicinal plants, architecture. The traditional design is very cyclone-proof, but now we're going to the Western-style house with walls, so we need to look at those architectural styles and see how we can make new styles for use in cities, for example. And of course, traditional resource management practices. So we need to document these and get them back into policy and back into awareness and schools. And we're very happy with the fact that the world is starting to recognize that traditional management is the best management of resources. We're very happy that the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2009 was to Elinor Ostrom for her analysis of economic governance, basically saying that local resources are best managed by communities, according to, and indigenous communities were some of the examples she used. And of course, the IUCN has also been pushing this a lot of the time, and we hope that it will come up in the next Rio Convention, I think it's next year. It is a constant battle, however, to maintain and assert that our traditional forms and practices and structures can be a basis for national policy. Even when it's so apparent to us, it's very difficult because traditional practices are not well documented in a way that provides for policy input. So we need to improve our ways of documenting our traditional practices. There are a few models for using traditional practices as a basis for policy. We don't have many human resources, people able to negotiate the interface between communities and bureaucracy. And it's a problem of our education system as well, where when you become educated, you become less knowledgeable about traditional knowledge. Ability to translate traditional cultural values and practices into the bureaucratic form required to input into policy. And one of the key problems is it's so easy to be persuaded to adopt Western policy solutions. Why? Because you have people like UNICEF, all the big development agencies coming and saying, this is how you deal with a social protection scheme for the country. You have welfare, the government puts, this kind of stuff. You have the big environmental organizations coming and saying, lock away areas, make national parks. And they come with this philosophy with lots of money to back it up. Do this, we'll be giving you this money to implement. And so for the bureaucrats who are cash-strapped, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it to get those extra computers we need and the money we need to travel around and do awareness. So it's easy to lack the constant rigor that you require to continue to insist to ensure that cultural practices and values are utilized as a starting point for policy interventions. And one of the last policy intervention I'll talk about is the development of alternative indicators of well-being, and this is going very well, I'm happy to report. We have held a regional conference to define what is well-being for Melanesians. So people from all the Melanesian region came. What are the contributing factors to well-being for Melanesians? And we've identified 3 broad domains that are currently not measured in national accounts. And these are access to and availability of customary land, strength of social relationships and Melanesian values, and an understanding of and ability to participate in customary practices. So now these alternative indicators of well-being have been surveyed, they've been tested. We are now going to phase 2, where we're doing regional consultations with statistical officers outside in other countries, and it's going to the regional level now, the sub-regional level, through the sub-regional Melanesian Spearhead Group. And interestingly, we found that the first testing of these indicators found that the areas of the country that were most removed from development were in fact the most well-off. So in my conclusion, I'd just like to say that I'm one of a number of people going into politics. So my colleague minister is here, Tina, Minister of Community and Cultural Affairs in Palau, formerly director of the National Museum for almost 20 years, was it? Lord Albert Vaya, who's on the Pima board also, is the Minister of Agriculture, Food, Forest and Fisheries in Tonga. So we're hoping that we can take these ideas from Pima, from our cultural institutions, and put them into policy at a national level. The end result, I think, or the objective is control of how we go into the future. We control, we decide, and then we go. Intergenerational equity for our cultural and natural resources, and trying to get rid of this psychology of dependency that we all have. It's been ingrained in our, and it's very hard to get out. And we have to constantly remind ourselves that, no, we're not second best. What we have is the best. And of course, dealing with politics and bureaucracy and that structure that we can't get away from. We're trying to see how we can make it culture friendly. I'll let you know how that goes. But also, of course, we rely on changes at international level. We're relying on the fact that at some point, the world community is going to say, no, economic growth based on GDP is not a good indicator of well-being. And I mean, everyone knows that now, but the message has not changed. And we're very happy, those who were at the amazing lunchtime talk yesterday by Walter Ecohawk, to hear of things like the draft declaration becoming the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These kind of things give us hope that the international support will come. And these constant pressures to move away from our culture will become pressures to use our culture for development. So thank you.